The soft, cerulean sky over King's Landing betrayed little of the savage churn of events that had overtaken the city. Thin clouds drifted languidly above spires once gilded with power, above parapets that had heard too many desperate oaths. The midday sun glinted off the great September of Baylor, igniting the seven-pointed star etched into its highest dome. The city below was restless, rivulets of fear and reverence running through every cobbled street. Though the tumult of war and the politicking of lords had long plagued the capital, what happened now was different, a transformation that seemed to come from within the very soul of the realm. The faith militant patrolled in pairs, their staves scraping against stone, their eyes scanning faces for signs of sin or dissent. Where once the banners of House Baratheon or House Lannister might have dominated the thoroughfares, there now stood the pennants of the Seven, stark white cloth with a single star shining black in its center. Within the marble halls of the Great September, the air smelled of incense and dust. Echoing footsteps of the devout sounded like a heartbeat in that cavernous chamber. The High Sparrow, the man who had once worn rags and tended to the poor, now knelt in solitary contemplation before the grand altar. He prayed, but his prayers were weighted with more than humble supplication. Before him was not merely the figure of the crone or the warrior, but the promise of an entire realm, his realm as he had come to see it. When he finally rose, the sunlight streaming through the glass made a halo around his head, and those who watched were seized by awe or dread. In that moment, something changed in his eyes, as though he had accepted a burden so immense that it could only be shouldered by one wholly convinced of his own rectitude. He had taken King Tommen under his protective wing shortly after wresting power from the Lannisters. The boy had been ill-prepared to rule. Confusion haunted his days, and the High Sparrow's paternal guidance had, for a while, seemed benign. Then came the fervor of the faith, an unstoppable tide stoked by the High Sparrow's sermons of moral rebirth, of a world reordered under the strict laws of the Seven. Tommen's every breath had been observed, every choice scrutinized. Gradually, the boy king found he had less space for princely indulgences, fewer moments in which he could even consider defiance. The High Sparrow had gained influence not just over the throne but over the hearts of the poor, those masses in Flea Bottom who had lived with nothing, who yearned for a world that might finally bring them justice. No knight in golden armor had ever defended them from cruelty, but a man in plain robes, living among them, had proven that righteousness might indeed be more powerful than steel. It was whispered in corridors that Tommen had grown listless, as though some vital spark was slipping from him day by day. He no longer attended to the small council. He no longer smiled. Perhaps he had begun to suspect he was no true king. Perhaps he saw that the realm's loyalties were turning to a man with calloused hands and a tongue that promised moral deliverance. Then, late one night, a rumor spread. Tommen was dead. Whether by poison or heartbreak or by his own hand, no one was certain, and the High Sparrow's watchers did not see fit to clarify. A hush descended on King's Landing, as though the entire city inhaled and held its breath. By dawn, the bells of the Great September tolled low and ominous, resonating across the city like a prophecy. The masses were summoned to the steps of the September later that same day. Soldiers of the faith militant cleared the approach, and thousands of small folk gathered, their voices hushed in a foreboding mix of alarm and expectation. The nobility arrived in black carriages, some with the old sigils hidden, for such colors were no longer safe. Each house recognized that what they were about to witness was no mere funeral. The High Sparrow appeared before them in plain robes, head bowed, and spoke of King Tommen's tragic passing. He spoke of the boy as a pitiable victim of worldly evils, a child caught in the snares of a decadent, sinful court. His words were soft, but they carried on the wind like a clarion call. He invoked the Seven themselves, claiming that a new order had dawned. Where once kings had treated the faith as a tool, now the faith would become the guiding hand of the realm. No one dared speak. No one dared even shift their weight upon aching feet. The High Sparrow then lifted his chin, and in his eyes burned a conviction so fierce it seemed to light the horizon. He declared the throne of King's Landing to be an inheritance not of bloodlines, but of spiritual authority bestowed by the Seven. He declared that kings of old had sullied that throne, using it for greed, lust, and tyranny. Then he said, in a voice that shook the watchers to their very marrow, that he himself would bear the burden of uniting the realm under the righteous rule of the seven, to lead the people as their shepherd and king in one. The hush broke into a tumult of whispers. The wealthy lords turned pale, silent, uncertain whether to cheer or resist. The small folk, so many of whom credited him for their first taste of justice, were caught between wonder and anxiety. And so, with that pronouncement, the High Sparrow placed a crown of plain steel, marked only with the seven-pointed star, upon his own brow. He lifted both hands as if in benediction, and the faith militant roared in approval, their staffs pounding against the steps in a thunderous rhythm. Thus, King's Landing awoke to a new day with the High Sparrow as the self-anointed king of the seven kingdoms, though how many of those kingdoms truly bent the knee was as yet unclear. In the immediate aftermath, the city teemed with murmurs. Some proclaimed it a blessing that a man of the cloth and the people would now reign, promising the faithful an end to the corruption that had swallowed the capital. Others shuddered at the uncharted territory, knowing well that men who hold both the sword and the god's authority in their hands can become unstoppable tyrants. But the High Sparrow began his reign not with lavish feasts or decrees of celebration. Instead, he declared a period of mourning and purification, announcing that the extravagance of the Red Keep would be dismantled and its wealth distributed among the poor. He declared that lords and ladies with ill-gotten fortunes must atone through large tithes to the faith. The first time his new laws were tested, men in fine clothes who dared question him were dragged before the Starry Court, a newly revived ecclesiastical tribunal, and forced to confess their sins under the watchful eyes of the faith militant. Cersei Lannister had vanished from the city days after Tommen's death. Whether she was in hiding or had been captured somewhere by the new enforcers of the faith remained a matter of rumor. Most suspected she had either fled to the Westerlands or was taken by the faith and imprisoned in some dark cell. Even the new king did not speak of her. Meanwhile, the Red Keep slowly transformed. Statues of lions were toppled, their broken remains left in courtyards as grim examples of hubris undone. The royal apartments were stripped of their silks and gold. A hush fell over the once bustling corridors. Servants donned plain robes in solidarity with the faith. The Targaryen dragon skulls, once hidden in the dungeons by prior regimes, were rumored to have been destroyed, hammered to shards in a symbolic rejection of the old ways. Anyone who entered the keep found themselves subjected to a new code, humility above all else. Wealth became a badge of sin, and the faith militant wasted no time punishing those who resisted tithes or moral scrutiny. Among the populace, responses ranged from joy to horror. The poor of Flea Bottom lined up at new soup kitchens run by the faith, collecting bowls of thin stew and hardened bread. Though it was meager, it was more than they were used to. Beggars found themselves permitted to sleep under the protection of septons and septas. The High Sparrow walked occasionally among them, flanked by sparrows in rough-spun habits, speaking words of comfort, reminding them that each day was a trial leading to the redemption of the seven kingdoms. Some exclaimed that no king had ever shown them such kindness. Others could not shake the sense that the city had become a fortress of fanaticism, that they were all living under a single unwavering eye. And so the days slipped into weeks, then into moons. The High Sparrow, in newly minted texts, styled His Holiness King of the Seven, called upon the lords of Westeros to send tribute. Couriers rode out in all directions, delivering the proclamations. The new king has claimed the Iron Throne, they said, though the seat itself was never used by him. He presided over judgments within the Great September, enthroned on a high-backed chair of plain oak. Word traveled to the north, to the Vale, to Dorne, to the Iron Islands, and across the Narrow Sea. Some houses quietly humored him, sending small tithes to avoid immediate confrontation. Others refused outright, outraged that a mere commoner would declare himself king. Rebellion simmered, but for the moment, none of these far-flung lords and ladies could muster a unified front, still exhausted from the War of the Five Kings. And so, unchallenged, the High Sparrow's authority took root. Within the capital, new forms of punishment surfaced. Public confessions became spectacles in the square before the great September commoners and lesser lords were made to atone for sins real or fabricated. The High Sparrow oversaw many trials himself, granting absolution if the condemned prostrated themselves and vowed unwavering loyalty to the faith. For the most grievous crimes, murder, heresy, acts of treason against the faith, there was only one sentence: to be given to the stranger. On scaffolds erected where the statue of King Joffrey once stood, the condemned would be hanged or beheaded, accompanied by fervent chanting of septons. The High Sparrow never looked away. He watched each sentence carried out, head bowed in prayer, murmuring quiet benedictions as if to usher the souls to whatever awaited them beyond mortal existence. Not all accepted this transformation quietly. Just a fortnight after the High Sparrow's coronation, a group of young knights and minor lords dared to conspire in secret to restore the old monarchy. They planned to incite a riot, assassinate the High Sparrow, and place one of the Targaryen pretenders rumored to be across the sea on the throne. Yet the faith had eyes and ears in every hovel and inn. Before the conspirators could strike, they were seized by the faith militant and brought in chains to the September. Under the unyielding glare of silent sisters, the knights were stripped of their armor and forced to stand trial. When the High Sparrow asked if they repented, some spat curses, claiming the faith was a tyranny. Others trembled and pleaded. In the end, all were sentenced to die. King's Landing watched, transfixed, as the executions took place at dawn. The conspirators were hanged in a row, left to sway for 2 days as a warning to those who would defy God's chosen king. Whispers spread that the High Sparrow had become a man of ruthless resolve, capable of any severity in the name of holiness. In the subsequent hush, open defiance melted away. Jaime Lannister heard these accounts while in Riverrun, attempting to hold together what fragments remained of House Lannister's dominion. He found himself at a bitter crossroads. Once the Warden of the East, and a legend for his skill with a sword, despite losing his sword hand, Jaime could barely recognize the realm. The Lord Commander of the King's Guard, sworn to protect Tommen, now heard that Tommen was gone, replaced by a so-called Holy King. His sisters were scattered. His father was dead. His name, once spoken with awe, was now reviled. Jaime felt a dull ache in the stump where his sword hand had been, as if it longed for a chance to strike. But with the Lannister forces still weakened, and the Riverlands in turmoil, he had no direct path to retribution. Even if he mustered men, the High Sparrow's hold on King's Landing might prove unassailable. The commoners themselves seemed seduced by his message, and the faith militant had grown vastly in number. There were rumors of thousands newly armed in the capital. Jaime wrote letters to the Lords Tyrell, to the remains of House Baratheon, to the Vale, to any who might stand against this theocracy. Yet the replies he received were tepid. The realm was exhausted. Some lords feared that challenging the High Sparrow would only result in excommunication and uprisings from their own small folk, who were beginning to see the High Sparrow as the living embodiment of the Seven. Meanwhile, within the Great September, Margaery Tyrell languished in forced devotion. Though she had been released from her earlier imprisonment by the faith, her every step was monitored. Queen in name no longer, Tommen's death had stripped her of that status. She remained a hostage of sorts, a living symbol of the new regime's magnanimity, so the High Sparrow would say. She spent her days reading from the seven-pointed star under the watchful eye of Septas, who insisted she complete penances for her sins. The High Sparrow would occasionally request her presence in public gatherings, there to display her piety. She learned to bow her head and recite verses, though inside her, a quiet anger simmered. She knew how to wear a facade better than most. The same smile that once entranced kings now served to hide her mind's machinations. She observed the High Sparrow's governance and recognized the cunning behind his every action. He fed the poor to earn their adoration. He tore down the old houses so none could challenge him. He spoke softly but carried the might of unshakable faith. For now she waited. If there was any chance to reclaim power for her family, it would require subtlety and caution. In the corridors of the Red Keep, bare and ascetic as they had become, Lancel Lannister, once the king's cousin and now a zealous devotee of the faith, played a pivotal role. He had shaved his head and wore the gray robes of a penitent warrior, though he still carried a sword. Serving as the High Sparrow's chief enforcer, he ensured that potential threats were subdued before they grew. He had turned against his own kin, convinced that in so doing he served the gods. At times, he led raids on the mansions of lords suspected of hoarding wealth. At others, he sat in the starry court, overseeing the confessions of minor lords. Those who witnessed his cold, distant gaze said Lancel had become a specter of zealotry, as if any fragment of boyish warmth had been snuffed out by what he believed was a higher purpose. His presence loomed large in the nightmares of the old aristocracy. Outside the walls, fields once ravaged by war were slowly being replanted. The small folk might have found some solace, were it not for the heavy tithes demanded by the faith. Any harvest surplus was expected to be offered in gratitude to the Seven. Farmers complied out of fear or genuine piety. Banditry in the Crownlands decreased, as criminals found themselves pursued relentlessly by the faith militant, who tortured them into confessions and displayed their bodies on pikes near the roads to King's Landing. Travelers noted that the city had never seemed so orderly, though the hush that hung over the streets at night felt more like the quiet of a funeral than the thriving heartbeat of a capital. Taverns stayed open only briefly and sold watery ale, priced cheaply but with a portion of the profits required to go to the local September. To many, it seemed as though a strange, gray morality had settled over the city, one in which any step outside the lines of piety could bring condemnation. The sensual illusions of life, wine, song, dance, were suppressed in favor of austere worship. Yet the High Sparrow's proclamations insisted these were necessary sacrifices to forge a realm free of sin. As the first year of his rule neared its end, the High Sparrow sent out a new summons to the great lords, commanding them to come to King's Landing and witness the coronation anew, an affirmation of the realm's fealty to the Seven and to him as their divinely appointed monarch. Many resisted, some refused to answer at all, but a handful recognized an opportunity. Among them was Peter Baelish, Littlefinger, who, with his typical slyness, arrived in the city under the guise of compliance. He brought a modest retinue, wearing simpler clothes than usual, but the spark in his eyes betrayed his ambitions. He found an audience with the High Sparrow, who greeted him in the Great September. The hall's pillars soared overhead, the light from stained-glass windows painting patches of color on the marble floor. Littlefinger spoke softly, full of courtesies. "Your Holiness, your piety shines bright over the land. I come to offer the Vale's tribute." He bowed, presenting a small wooden chest filled with silver. The High Sparrow regarded him, his gaze piercing. Lancel Lannister stood behind the new king, arms folded, as though ready to seize Littlefinger at a moment's notice. "Lord Baelish," said the High Sparrow, his voice carefully measured, "I recall you were once master of coin under a corrupt regime. One wonders if your ledger of sins has been fully accounted for." Littlefinger lowered his eyes in a gesture of humility. "I was but a servant of a flawed king, striving to keep the realm's finances afloat. I have since sought forgiveness and have come here to show my devotion to the true path." The High Sparrow let silence linger, the hush echoing in the vast space. "Forgiveness is earned through confession and penance. Are you prepared to name your sins?" Without missing a beat, Littlefinger offered a list of petty manipulations, carefully omitting his deadlier games. He performed contrition with a grace that almost matched that of Marjorie Tyrell's well-honed humility. The High Sparrow studied him for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "I see you are skilled in the ways of men, Lord Baelish. The realm has need of such skills, provided they serve the faith. For now I accept your tribute. But mark me, if ever you deceive the faith, there will be no mercy." The new king's voice echoed with finality, and Lancel nodded coldly. Littlefinger bowed deeper, hiding the subtle flicker in his eyes, which betrayed that he already considered the conversation a small victory. There would be ways to maneuver yet. The faith might be unstoppable for now, but every fortress had its cracks. If there was a path back to power, Peter Baelish would find it. Beyond the city, the lords who refused to come faced new pressures. Envoys arrived at their gates, carrying the faith's official demands. Those demands came with pointed warnings, reminders that the small folk in every domain had begun to turn their gaze toward the Seven's justice. If a lord defied the High Sparrow, how long before his own peasants rose up, guided by traveling septons who preached the new order? The faith had grown from within, among the very hearts of the poor who had suffered under neglectful or cruel liege lords. Now that neglected base of power was awakened and fervent. Rebellion from below was as potent a threat as any army. Some lords, especially in the Reach, quietly complied, sending gold and supplies. Others gritted their teeth and prepared for the possibility of war. Yet the realm had bled so much in recent years, winter had perhaps still to come, though the snows had not yet gripped the south, and no one had the stomach for further devastation. So the High Sparrow's dominion widened like a spreading inkblot on parchment, slow but unstoppable. In King's Landing, every passing day wove new threads into the tapestry of the High Sparrow's theocracy. The cobbler who had once toiled for scraps was now a voice of piety in his district, encouraging neighbors to hand over their valuables for the faith's cause. The septa who had once cowered during Joffrey's monstrous reign now chanted with solemn pride, dispensing moral judgments to passers-by. Houses that had been the seats of wealth for generations found themselves forced to open their granaries and treasuries to the needy. The city's atmosphere was at once peaceful and oppressive, as if a hush had fallen over every street corner, and that hush was patrolled by thousands of eyes. One wrong word, one idle complaint about the faith, might bring the enforcers to your door. Or it might not. Perhaps you would be safe so long as you performed the gestures of obedience. Uncertainty gnawed at the hearts of many. Yet the High Sparrow's speeches, delivered every seventh day before the masses, kept the small folk rapt. He spoke of a world without sin, a union of souls bound by love of the Seven. His voice quivered with genuine passion, and people believed him, or they learned to act as if they did. Amidst this dynamic, Margaery Tyrell's patience bore fruit. She feigned devotion so flawlessly that the septas who watched her gave her a small measure of freedom. She befriended a young septa named Delina, who whispered her own doubts about whether the faith's severity truly served the gods' love. Margaery, with careful subtlety, encouraged these doubts. Together they hatched a plan for smuggling messages beyond the city, hoping to spark alliances that might one day check the High Sparrow's power. Although Margaery's station was reduced, she was still known to many lords, and her words carried weight. She authored letters in the secrecy of night, painting a dire picture of King's Landing as a city on the brink, one that might soon turn its fanatic gaze outward to conquer the rest of Westeros by moral force, or by sword. Those messages found their way to the Vale, to the north, and across the sea to Dorne. Some lords dismissed them as exaggerations. They had heard so many pleas from so many corners. But others took note, seeing that if the faith militant could tighten its grip on the Crownlands, it might next claim the Stormlands or the Reach in full. The Tyrells of Highgarden had split internally. Some believed supporting the High Sparrow was easier than waging a losing battle, while others, especially the heirs of Mace Tyrell, raged at the humiliation inflicted upon Margaery. Yet no unified front arose. The High Sparrow's greatest victory was not in his swords but in the exhaustion of the realm, its fracturing, and its guilt-laden acceptance of a moral crusade. Within the city, however, a small, secret circle began to form. A swirl of individuals who saw the High Sparrow's reign as an abomination. They were knights, merchants, and lesser lords whose property had been seized. They met in dark alleys and in abandoned cellars. Each time they gathered, they risked infiltration by the faith spies. They shared stories of the High Sparrow's cruelty, planning ways to strike at him. Could they kill him outright? Seize the September? They recognized quickly that a straightforward assassination might only lead to a worse crackdown. The High Sparrow had become more symbol than man. Killing him could turn him into a martyr, stoking the faithful to even greater fervor. No, they needed a different approach, something that would undercut the faith's moral high ground, or something that would sow enough doubt among the small folk to erode the foundation of the theocracy. The impetus came from an unexpected angle, a rumor of certain transgressions committed by members of the faith militant themselves. A guard at the gate had seen a group of those stern warriors drunkenly attack a young woman. Another rumor told of shipments of gold that never reached the poor but ended up in hidden caches beneath the September. Perhaps such stories were true, or perhaps they were fabrications spawned by desperation. But in King's Landing, where the High Sparrow's absolute moral authority rested on the faith's purity, revelations of hypocrisy could crack the facade wide open. Those conspirators set about gathering evidence, recording statements from terrified witnesses. They smuggled out scraps of paper bearing the seven-pointed star, which had been used to seal shipments that vanished without explanation. The plan was to stage a public exposure of the faith's corruption, to confront the High Sparrow in front of the throngs he so often addressed, in hopes that this would shock the populace into seeing him not as a saint but as a mere mortal, if not a liar. Such a plan was fraught with peril. The faith had eyes everywhere, and betrayal among the conspirators was a constant worry. The day of the grand revelation approached, but the conspirators suffered a blow. A merchant's wife who was part of their ranks disappeared after stepping into a sept for confession. Her body turned up days later, floating in the Blackwater rush, her face bruised and unrecognizable. Panic rippled through the conspiracy. Some insisted on fleeing at once. Others argued that they had come too far to retreat. Ultimately, they pressed on. They arranged for a festival day, one of the High Sparrow's mass sermons, where crowds would be thick and attention high. They bribed a handful of city criers to shout out the accusations at the height of the sermon, brandishing proof of the faith militants' misdeeds. In that moment of confusion, the conspirators hoped the crowd might rally, or at least that the seeds of doubt would be planted, forcing the High Sparrow onto the defensive. On the appointed day, the High Sparrow ascended the steps of the September, wearing his threadbare robes and plain steel crown. The faith militant flanked him, their formation tidy as an honor guard. At his side was Lancel Lannister, expression as severe as the Seven Hells. Candles flickered in the breezes off Blackwater Bay. The masses bowed their heads. The High Sparrow began his oration in a resonant voice, exalting the virtues of humility and condemning the vices of greed. He told them the realm was healing, that though the path was hard, the Seven's grace lit the way. Faint murmurs of approval spread through the gathered throng. Then, at a carefully chosen moment, the conspirators' criers began shouting from different corners of the crowd. They did so in a practiced rhythm, each voice rising over the hush. They named members of the faith militant who had stolen from the poor, who had assaulted the innocent. They brandished proof, a handful of letters stamped with the faith star that catalogued missing funds. One crier bellowed, "Your Holiness, will you answer for these crimes among your ranks? Or do you hide from the truth as the wicked kings before you did?" A ripple of shock stirred the crowd. The High Sparrow paused mid-sentence. His watery blue eyes swept across the throng, where confusion and agitation grew. The conspirators exchanged glances, hearts pounding. Was this the moment the people would see? The air felt taut, like a cord about to snap. Then, in a voice that carried no anger but a profound sadness, the High Sparrow spoke. "If there are traitors within our ranks, we must root them out. Show me this proof." The criers stepped forward cautiously, passing him the letters and statements. For a moment, the High Sparrow's gaze flickered with something that might have been alarm, or perhaps calculation. A hush enveloped the square. Then he nodded. "These are grave accusations indeed. My children, you must know that the faith is composed of men, and men are fallible. If any of my warriors have sinned, they shall face judgment." One of the criers stepped up even closer, brandishing more damning evidence. "We have eyewitnesses, willing to testify that the faith militant took advantage of them, that your cause is not so pure." The High Sparrow turned to the crowd, raising both hands. "I have never claimed purity, only obedience to the Seven. If these allegations are true, the faith militant shall atone. But let us not conflate the sins of a few misguided soldiers with the holiness of our mission." His voice rapped the crowd like a sermon, gentle but firm. "We stand against corruption. We stand for the weak. Have you, good people of King's Landing, not seen how we feed you, clothe you, protect you from the chaos that once reigned in these streets? A wave of murmurs followed. Indeed, many in the crowd had found a stability they never knew before. The conspirators tried to shout back, to insist that the High Sparrow himself had knowledge of these crimes. But they were drowned out by the stirring of the faith militant. In seconds, the front lines of the crowd parted to allow armed men to seize the criers. Some shouted, "Traitors! Blasphemers!" The crowd's mood swung wildly, torn between shock, curiosity, and the comfort of the High Sparrow's paternal presence. The conspirators found themselves overwhelmed. Where they had hoped to spark a single conflagration of doubt, they now faced the reality that many in the crowd would defend the High Sparrow. They had not accounted for how deeply his sermons had taken hold, how much fear and gratitude mingled together in the hearts of the poor. At the High Sparrow's nod, Lancel stepped forward and denounced the criers for sowing discord. The crowd parted further, and the conspirators began to realize they were trapped. Some tried to flee, but the faith militant was ready. They seized the men who had orchestrated the unveiling. In the scuffle, a few bystanders were knocked down. One crier yelled that the High Sparrow was a liar, a murderer, but his shouts were drowned in the clamor. Soon, the conspirators found themselves pushed to the ground, arms pinned behind their backs. The High Sparrow did not raise his voice once. He merely let the might of the faith's public support wash over the square like a wave, swallowing dissent. In one corner, a city crier, bribed earlier, tried to stand up and rally support for the accusations, only to be beaten by a group of the devout who believed him a heretic. When the melee cleared, the High Sparrow looked out at the stunned crowd. "It grieves me," he said, voice trembling with sorrow, "to see such methods employed, for these men might have come to me in private so we could root out any corruption together. Instead, they incited turmoil. Let it be known we shall investigate these claims. If any of my warriors have truly sinned, they will be punished. But those who would sow chaos among the faithful shall face the judgment of the seven." He pointed to the conspirators who lay bound. "They shall be tried in the starry court, that the truth may be unveiled and justice done." And so the crowd, still uncertain but calmed by the High Sparrow's composed response, began to disperse. The conspirators were dragged away, their carefully gathered evidence seized and locked within the vaults of the September. Whatever moral victory they might have gained was lost in the fervor of a public that had come to rely on the High Sparrow's paternal rule. Later that evening, rumors circulated that some members of the faith militant had indeed been taken for questioning, to show the High Sparrow's impartiality. But no one expected them to receive a harsh sentence. Whispered guesses said the entire spectacle would be blamed on a few wayward souls, while the conspirators themselves would be forced into humiliating confessions. In the days that followed, the High Sparrow offered public prayers for unity, and the matter of corruption within the faith militant was framed as a small stain on an otherwise pristine cloth. Lancel Lannister oversaw the swift condemnation of the conspirators. The city drew its breath and exhaled, returning to its usual hush. Fear and reverence kept the peace. For many, the moment to resist the theocracy had come and gone, overshadowed by the High Sparrow's calm assurance and the faith militant's swift, disciplined reaction. Amid these events, Marjorie Tyrell weighed the attempt. She had known of the conspiracy but had deemed it too reckless, likely to backfire. Now she was sure it had. For the High Sparrow to truly fall, the realm's greatest houses would have to unite, or a scandal so immense would have to break his grip on the small folk. But none of that seemed forthcoming, and so she waited, continuing her subtle outreach through the young Septa Delina, continuing to wear the mask of piety. The High Sparrow, for his part, sensed that the realm would not remain quiescent forever. In the stillness of his private chamber, once the extravagant solar of the High Septon, he knelt in reflection. Candles surrounded him, their flames dancing in the gloom. The weight of the steel crown pressed on his brow. Though he believed devoutly in his mission, he was not blind to the enemies that gathered in the shadows. The illusions of absolute power beckoned him, whispering that with a tighter grip, he could quell all dissent. He prayed to the seven, beseeching them for guidance, and perhaps somewhere in the deep quiet of his mind, he felt that the realm's fear gave him power beyond measure, that if the war-weary lords and ladies did not yield willingly, the faith militant could enforce their submission. But to tread that path meant shedding more blood, and he had once claimed that all the horror he inflicted was for the sake of a purer future. Would he be willing to become a greater tyrant than the kings he overthrew? In the second year of his reign, winter finally crept down toward the crownlands. Frost touched the fields and nights grew bitter. The small folk, ironically, found some relief in the faith's well-stocked granaries, seized from the nobility, where bread and barley were rationed. The High Sparrow's charitable distribution won renewed gratitude from a populace that might otherwise have starved. Of course, some suspected it was another means of ensuring loyalty. Without the faith's handouts, many families would freeze or starve in the cold months, and so the city's hold on them tightened. Among the destitute, the High Sparrow was lauded as a savior. Even those who disliked him found themselves bowing, for hunger is a powerful persuader. Meanwhile, the High Sparrow convened a grand council of the faithful. Septons from across Westeros braved the cold to arrive in King's Landing. Many carried with them the grudges of their local lords, or the concerns of their parishioners, but all knew the High Sparrow commanded them. In a solemn ceremony, reminiscent of the ancient traditions of Old Town, they declared that the seat of the High Septon was now irrevocably united with the throne of the realm. The seven demanded a single shepherd to guide their flock. The small council, once the heart of royal governance, was replaced by the Council of the Seven, a body of devout men and women selected for their unwavering piety. They oversaw taxation, justice, and the distribution of resources according to the faith's doctrine. The old laws of the realm were revised in line with the teachings of the seven-pointed star. Adultery became not just a private sin but a crime punishable by public whipping or worse. Usury was banned. Brothels were shuttered. The trade in foreign luxuries that served no practical purpose was heavily restricted. King's Landing lost much of its cosmopolitan vibrancy. Merchants who once thrived on exotic goods found themselves ruined or driven away. Some said the city was becoming little better than a grand monastery, locked under the watchful eye of the faithful. Tales spread that the High Sparrow had exhumed the remains of Joffrey Baratheon and thrown them to the river as a final condemnation of the Boy King's wickedness. Others whispered that the Silent Sisters, under his orders, had scoured the entire Red Keep for hidden passages, ensuring no secrets remained. The Queen Regent's old chambers lay bare and empty, her rumored skeletons exposed to the light. But no sign of Cersei Lannister was found. Some wondered if she plotted somewhere in the distant hills, raising an army to retake her city. Yet no banners of Lannister gold advanced on King's Landing. The High Sparrow's grip remained steady, and even the roaches that scuttled in the dark corners of the Red Keep seemed to bow in submission. As winter's chill deepened, the lords beyond the Crownlands faced their own crises. The north contended with heavy snowfalls. The Vale was locked behind mountain passes. Dorne eyed the events in the capital with disdain but stayed quiet. The Reach, where House Tyrell maintained power, was the most likely to mount a challenge, but internal divisions and the High Sparrow's infiltration of local septs hampered any organized resistance. Jaime Lannister roamed the Riverlands, trying in vain to unite the scattered remnants of loyal forces. He found little success, only hollow pledges of future support. Without the common cause or a figurehead with the rightful claim to the throne, his efforts fell short. Then a glimmer of possibility arose. Word reached Jaime that there was a living Targaryen across the sea, a young man rumored to be Aegon VI, who had landed in the Stormlands with a modest force. Though rumors of Targaryen claimants had abounded for years, this one supposedly carried the backing of the Golden Company. Jaime saw a chance. If this Targaryen were real, he might unite those who despised the High Sparrow. Jaime set out to meet envoys, forging a clandestine pact. Other lords, too, turned their ears. If the Targaryen banner rose again, the devout small folk might be torn. Some, after all, still revered the memory of dragons. But the High Sparrow heard these whispers as well. He took counsel with Lancel and the Council of the Seven, deciding how best to address a potential Targaryen threat. Some of his advisors proposed a full condemnation, labeling Targaryen fire and blood as an affront to the Seven. Others suggested forging an alliance, for if the Targaryen bent the knee to the new theocracy, the realm could be fully united. The High Sparrow, pensive, recognized that if the Targaryen gained the love of the small folk, the faith could be supplanted. So he prepared for conflict. Yet the Targaryen advancement was slow, beset by storms and the complexities of forging alliances in a fractured land. Many small lords were simply too frightened of the faith's wrath to openly declare for the dragon. Winter's hazards further impeded progress, and so the theocracy continued to solidify its position, day by day. The Starry Court churned out sentences of penance and punishments, filling the city's squares with the stench of guilt and fear. The faith militant, its ranks swollen, patrolled the roads leading into King's Landing. The High Sparrow took on an almost mythic stature, an unassailable vessel of the Seven's will. Even the best swords of the realm would find it difficult to strike through the living wall of worshippers who believed in him. It was in these bleak midwinter days that Margaery Tyrell made the most daring move of her confinement. She had written letters to her grandmother, the formidable Lady Olenna, asking for aid in toppling the High Sparrow. Those letters had vanished into uncertain channels. But she received a coded reply through an ally in the Reach, an old retainer who once served House Tyrell. The message was brief. Beware. Allies watch. A new spring must bloom. Patience. Margaery burned the note after reading. She interpreted it as a promise of sorts, that those loyal to her family were gathering in secret. Yet the lines also implied that no immediate rescue was forthcoming, that for now she must survive the winter under the High Sparrow's rule. She employed the same cunning she once used in courtly intrigue, turning it into a display of saintly devotion. She sewed clothing for the poor, prayed at every dawn and dusk, donated every jewel she had left. The septas around her, especially the devout ones, believed she was transformed, wholly dedicated to the Seven's cause. Some even whispered that perhaps she might become a revered voice in the faith. But the High Sparrow himself remained watchful. He would occasionally summon her, asking questions that probed beneath her veneer. "What does your heart tell you of your earthly family, Lady Margaery?" he would inquire, testing her loyalty. She answered carefully, "I pray for their souls, Your Holiness, that they might find the grace of the Seven. I have released my earthly attachments and hold only to the love of the gods." He would observe her in silence, then dismiss her, unconvinced but lacking proof of deceit. Lancel Lannister, too, watched her with a cold eye, remembering that once she had been queen, and that ambition does not easily die. But his faith in the High Sparrow was unwavering. He believed that even if Margaery plotted, the Seven would guide them to triumph. The might of their cause, in his mind, was absolute. Meanwhile, in the labyrinthine streets of the capital, a nameless woman in a tattered cloak gathered whispered accounts of the faith's successes. She had a scar on her cheek and eyes that burned with quiet ferocity. She had once been known to the city as Brienne of Tarth, though she had discarded her old armor and her old name. Having faced so much treachery, she now moved like a silent shadow. Rumors said she sought Sansa Stark, or was carrying out some vow to a dead king. Nobody truly knew, but in her wanderings, she witnessed the heartbreak of the small folk who had lost family to the faith's judgments. She saw hungry children forced to recite fervent prayers for morsels of bread. She saw men flogged in the streets for cursing the name of the new king. A simmering anger rose within her. She had witnessed monstrous things before, but this twisting of faith into tyranny struck her as a profound betrayal of all chivalric ideals. Yet she understood the danger. Alone, she could do nothing against the High Sparrow's vast apparatus of control. Still, she gathered stories carefully. Perhaps one day she would deliver them to a force capable of bringing justice. Seasons churned. The icy edges of winter still bit at King's Landing, though the city rarely saw snow like the north. The High Sparrow intensified his sermons, proclaiming that the Seven had tested the realm with winter's hardships, so it might emerge purged of sin when spring came. He insisted that any who defied the faith stood against the will of the gods. The Starry Court's judgments grew harsher. Humble floggings became floggings unto death. The faith militant marched with a new militancy, rooting out heretics and traitors more aggressively. King's Landing was strangled by piety, ironically reminiscent of the paranoid terror of past rulers. Yet cracks in the foundation spread. People began to notice how certain members of the faith militant enjoyed privileges denied to the laity. Whispers of hidden indulgences circulated, tested and spread by those who had once sought to expose them. The High Sparrow continued to proclaim discipline, dismissing such tales as the lies of the envious. But cynicism took root in corners of the city that once believed wholeheartedly. A single rumor, repeated enough times, can wear away the shine from even the holiest of crowns. Doubt festered in the hearts of those who had lost loved ones to the Theocracy's unyielding hand. At length, the Targaryen threat, under the rumored Aegon VI, advanced from the Stormlands. The faith militant prepared to confront them in open battle. The High Sparrow, in a departure from tradition, donned armor marked with the seven-pointed star. Atop a white horse, he rode out to address the troops who would march under the faith's banner. Thousands of men clad in white tabards, carrying staves, swords, and morning stars, filled the plain outside King's Landing. Each wore the symbol of the seven. They bowed their heads as he passed, chanting prayers. The High Sparrow himself seemed almost reluctant to lead them, though none could deny the fervor burning in his gaze. "Children," he said, voice echoing over the army. "The seven have called us to cleanse the realm. Do not thirst for bloodshed, but do not fear it either. We must protect the innocent from pretenders who would bring dragons and destruction upon our home. Stand firm in your faith, and the seven will guide your blades." The men cheered, though a faint undercurrent of unease rippled among those who remembered the last time dragons ruled Westeros. Faith might steal the soul, but dragonfire can melt flesh and steel alike. As the host marched southward, King's Landing found itself partially emptied of the faith militant. Lancel was among those who marched, leaving behind a strong garrison but reducing the ever-present watchfulness. This shift breathed a tentative hope into the hearts of those who loathed the Theocracy. Perhaps, in the High Sparrow's absence, an uprising might succeed. The thought spread in hushed whispers through the city's taverns and shadowy corners. It reached the ears of Margaery Tyrell, who realized this might be the best chance to topple the High Sparrow from within, especially if he were dealt a blow on the battlefield by the Targaryen pretender. And so she prepared, weaving quiet alliances among the remaining guards who still held loyalty to the old order. But as the Faith's army moved further from King's Landing, news arrived that the Targaryen host was smaller than expected, weakened by storms, still reliant on uncertain alliances. In fact, by the time the Faith's forces reached them, the Targaryens were forced to retreat strategically, avoiding open battle. Skirmishes flared along the Rose Road, neither side delivering a decisive blow. Some men of the Faith deserted, alarmed by the reality of facing dragons if indeed the rumored beasts accompanied Aegon, though the presence of living dragons was not confirmed. The High Sparrow pressed onward, determined to bring the upstart to heel and prove the dominion of the Seven. Meanwhile, the realm watched anxiously, uncertain if yet another war was about to tear Westeros apart. In King's Landing, the extended absence of the High Sparrow sowed confusion. The Council of the Seven tried to maintain order, but friction arose among them. Some demanded more tithes to feed the frontline troops. Others worried that draining the city's coffers would cause more unrest. Rumors of heresy multiplied. A small group of zealots began punishing anyone they deemed insufficiently pious, sparking riots in the poorer districts. Violence erupted near the Iron Gate when a Septon tried to seize a butcher's daughter, accusing her of licentious behavior. The city's tenuous calm frayed at the edges. Yet the fear of the Faith lingered, preventing a full-scale revolt. Margaery Tyrell, watching from the Great September, sensed that the final confrontation was approaching. She had no illusions that she alone could topple the regime. But she and her allies laid plans to seize control of the Great September if chaos erupted, to release prisoners from the dungeons, to open the city gates if an outside force arrived. She knew it was risky. A single betrayal could doom them all. Still, she felt the tension coiling tighter and tighter. The people's confusion, the fracturing authority, the possibility that the Targaryen might strike a blow in the field. It all spelled opportunity. Weeks passed. Then, one cold morning, word came that a major skirmish had taken place near Summerhall. The Targaryen forces, joined unexpectedly by a handful of lords from the Stormlands, had clashed with the Faith militant in a bloody engagement. Scores on both sides were slain. Among the casualties was Lancel Lannister, who had led a frontal charge. Some said he fought valiantly, chanting prayers until an arrow pierced his throat. Others claimed he turned craven at the last moment. None could say for sure. The Targaryen claimant reportedly survived, though wounded, and retreated to regroup. The Faith's ranks suffered grievous losses, including many of its fervent commanders. The High Sparrow himself survived, but the blow was keen. His godly aura had not prevented tragedy on the battlefield. King's Landing trembled at the news. For the first time, the unstoppable image of the Faith was tarnished. The High Sparrow, though still living, had lost his closest lieutenant and a large portion of his army. Rumors flew that the Targaryen had a legitimate claim and that he fought not to destroy the Faith but to free the realm from oppression. The seeds of doubt, once planted, began to sprout. Even the devout wondered how a mission blessed by the Seven could suffer so. The High Sparrow, with a fraction of his forces, was forced to withdraw for the time being, halting plans to vanquish Aegon. He set up camp in the countryside, sending urgent messages to the city to maintain order. It was at this moment of uncertainty that the conspirators within King's Landing seized their chance. By night, they spread word that the High Sparrow's defeat was inevitable, that a new power was rising to liberate the city. Sleeper cells of rebellious citizens gathered. Margaery Tyrell coordinated with them from within the September, passing messages through Septa Delina. They aimed to strike swiftly at the heart of the Faith's apparatus in King's Landing. If they could capture the Council of the Seven, free political prisoners, and rally the people under a banner of hope, they might open the gates to any friendly force, be it Targaryen or otherwise, that arrived. Near midnight, torches lit across several districts. Knots of armed rebels attacked the smaller outposts of the Faith militant. Caught off guard without their full strength, the militant units were quickly overwhelmed. Shouts rang through the streets. "Down with the pretender king! Down with the false Sparrow!" Citizens, either emboldened or simply hungry for chaos, joined the fray. The few members of the City Watch who remained loyal to the crown in name found themselves outnumbered. Within an hour, the rebels controlled large swathes of Flea Bottom and parts of the Street of Steel. The Council of the Seven locked themselves in the Red Keep, praying for divine intervention. The faithful rung the bells of the Great September in warning. But the rising throng pressed on, hungry for a chance at toppling their oppressors. Meanwhile, Margaery Tyrell orchestrated the infiltration of the September's dungeons, where many political prisoners languished. A dozen or so men loyal to House Tyrell, disguised as pious pilgrims, entered with hidden blades. They overpowered the guards and flung open cell doors. Those freed swarmed the corridors, overwhelming septas and untrained acolytes. Margaery, hearing the commotion, emerged from her chamber in a cloak. She led a rush toward the main hall, aiming to seize the council's records, documents that contained the Faith's blacklists and judgments. But before she could gather the crucial papers, a grim figure appeared at the top of the steps. One of the High Sparrow's most devout septons, flanked by a handful of Faith militant loyalists who had remained in the city. He raised a cudgel and bellowed, "Blasphemers! You dare defile this holy place!" A fight ensued, blades clashing, the sound of steel echoing off marble walls. Torchlight danced on the statues of the Seven. Margaery, no warrior herself, stayed back, directing her allies. The rebellion's fervor was fierce, but the Faith militant fought with the desperation of cornered zealots. Blood slicked the floors. Men died, cursing or praying. Women screamed. In the chaos, Margaery spotted a corridor leading to the archives. She dashed toward it, dragging along a wounded ally who insisted the documents must not be left to the Faith. Inside the archive chamber, shelves stuffed with scrolls reached the ceiling. Fire caught on some of them, set alight by an overturned brazier. Acrid smoke billowed upward. Outside, the Great September spells kept tolling, their clangs frantic and resonant. The city roiled in anarchy. Yet for many, this was a moment of catharsis. The tyrannical serenity enforced by the faith had crumbled, replaced by a savage outbreak of retribution. Those who had once been flogged took up arms against their tormentors. Houses that had been forced to pay ruinous tithes now unleashed their anger. The faith's loyalists fought back, but with much of their main army absent, they were overwhelmed. In the Red Keep, the Council of the Seven realized all was lost. Some tried to pray for a miracle. Others attempted to flee through secret passages. A handful were caught and put to the sword by the vengeful conspirators. Screams echoed through the castle's halls. For all the High Sparrow's pious intent, his subordinates were no match for the raw fury of a populace that had reached its breaking point. By dawn, the Great September's plaza was blackened by the remains of burning wagons and barricades. Bodies lay strewn about, some in the white robes of the faith militant, others in ragged clothes of the rebels. Smoke clung to the air, stinging eyes and lungs. Yet the city had changed hands. The faith's rule in King's Landing was undone. The people had risen with violence, choosing chaos over subjugation. Although pockets of fighting continued, the general tide had turned. Marjorie Tyrell emerged from the September in torn garments, soot smudging her face, leading a group of freed prisoners. She had in her possession several battered scrolls detailing the faith's confiscations and judgments, enough evidence to expose the hypocrisy at the heart of the regime. The crowd that gathered looked upon her as a symbol of hope, one who had outlasted the High Sparrow's tyranny and would, perhaps, help guide the city out of darkness. She did not claim the throne. She claimed only her freedom and the cause of the realm's liberation. Miles away, the High Sparrow received word of the city's fall. By the time the news reached him, his remaining forces were in disarray, locked in a stalemate with Targaryen loyalists. He sat in his campaign tent, crown on a table as if mocking him. He had believed wholeheartedly that the Seven had chosen him to cleanse the realm, to end the cycle of war and sin. And now his holy city, the seat of his power, was lost. His people, those he had sheltered and preached to, had risen against him, casting aside the yoke of his rule with a violence that matched any king's downfall. Lancel Lannister was dead, the council scattered, King's Landing in flames. At that moment, perhaps for the first time, the High Sparrow tasted the bitter fruit of a fanatic's dream turned to ashes. Devotion was not enough to quell the complexities of a realm battered by war. Zealotry could unify for a time but inevitably gave way to rebellion, especially when hypocrisy leaked through the cracks. In the end, he had little choice but to flee. Under cover of darkness, he slipped away with a handful of followers, abandoning the ragged remnants of the faith's army. Some say he meant to wander Westeros as a penitent once more, believing that the realm was still in need of spiritual guidance, but no longer trusting himself to rule. Others claim he was captured on the road by a band of outlaws who cared nothing for the Seven. Still others whisper that he headed north, to an austere monastery hidden in the mountains, determined to live out his last days in solitary communion with the gods he had tried, and failed, to serve in power. No one in King's Landing knew for certain. His disappearance became legend, and so ended the brief, tumultuous reign of the High Sparrow as king. King's Landing, of course, did not instantly transform into a land of peace and prosperity. The city reeled from the violence of the revolt. Flames had scarred entire blocks. Old animosities flared. With the faith militant banished or killed, lawlessness threatened. But in the emptiness left behind, new voices stepped forward. Survivors of noble houses, local leaders, and opportunists each claimed a piece of the city's governance. Marjorie Tyrell, heralded by some as a liberator, worked to restore a semblance of order. She called upon House Tyrell's resources to distribute grain, earning gratitude even among the poor. She opened negotiations with the Targaryen pretender, if only to keep further war from knocking at the gates. Whether she sought to become queen again, or was simply attempting to avert disaster, none could say for sure. The city, long overshadowed by the spires of the Great September, now found itself looking upon a ruined skyline, one that bore the scars of fanaticism. In the weeks and months that followed, ravens spread the news of the High Sparrow's fall across the realm. Some lords breathed relief, others dreaded the return of the old politics. Yet the specter of the Theocracy lingered in memory, a cautionary tale of what happens when men conflate their own ambition with the will of the gods. The faith of the Seven itself survived. Religion does not disappear so quickly. But it returned to a quieter role, overshadowed by the violence done in its name. The small folk, so easily manipulated by sermons promising deliverance, learned again that salvation does not come from a single mortal man, no matter how pious he may appear. All these changes, wrought by blood and fire in the streets of King's Landing, unfolded like a grim tapestry over the final months of winter. When the snows began to recede and a cold, early spring arrived, the city stood at a crossroads. The Iron Throne was empty, literally and symbolically. The Great September, though still physically present, no longer radiated unchallenged spiritual authority. A new wave of exiles and wanderers passed through, each with their own story. Among them were devout septons trying to mend the wounds inflicted by the Theocracy, knights seeking new causes, merchants eager for a chance to rebuild old trade routes, and a battered populace yearning for stability. High above, on the domes of the September, the seven-pointed star that once shone in black now showed tarnish from fires and neglect. Perhaps it was a sign that no mortal could perfectly embody the seven's virtues. Or perhaps it simply marked the inevitable course of history, a cycle of rise and fall, where illusions of perfect power crumble under the relentless weight of human nature. In the hush after the storm, King's Landing found itself neither damned nor saved, but searching for a future that might learn from the tyranny of the High Sparrow, who had crowned himself king and discovered that devotion without wisdom can sow as much destruction as any sword. No one could say whether the realm was better off for having tasted theocracy. Some argued it had merely traded one form of tyranny for another. Others pointed to the distribution of food and the fleeting sense of unity among the poor as proof that not all the High Sparrow did was evil. But in the hearts of most, the final memory of his rule was the pall of fear that hung over the city, the hiss of the whip in the square, the clang of faith-militant staves on cobblestone, and the tolling bells that presided over countless public executions. Those memories, etched into the soul of the city, would endure long after the ashes of the revolt scattered in the wind. In the end, the High Sparrow's story became a parable for Eptons and bards to recite in hushed tones, a reminder of how easily the oppressed can become oppressors when granted power, of how faith can be twisted into fanaticism, of how a dream of purity can lead to horrors that rival the sins it set out to destroy. And so Westeros, bruised by yet another chapter of turmoil, looked beyond the blackened spires and broken idols, wondering what new dawn might break, and dreading what fresh darkness might come with it. Each day, the city lived on, teeming with hucksters and orphans, soldiers and whores, lords and ladies, their fates woven in a tapestry as grand and unpredictable as the Seven Kingdoms themselves. And somewhere in that throng, the echo of the High Sparrow's last sermon might still be heard, carried by the wind. We are all children of the gods. It is not the crown that makes a king, but the will of the divine. A lesson half learned, half forgotten, leaving behind only the uncertain hush of a realm still searching for its soul. Dawn broke cold and colorless over King's Landing. Smoke still curled in ragged plumes from collapsed rooftops, and the tang of ash hung in the air where the faith's final strongholds had been assaulted overnight. Snow flurries, so unusual for the capital, drifted across burnt cobblestones, flecking everything in an incongruous white. Where the High Sparrow's banners once fluttered with the seven-pointed star, only tatters remained. Broken staves of the faith militant lay discarded in gutters, half submerged in blackened slush. Amid the wreckage, the people stirred as if waking from a troubled dream. They had overthrown the High Sparrow's rule, but what emerged in the aftermath was no gleaming sunrise. Instead, an uneasy hush gripped the city, punctuated by the groans of the injured and the laments of those who had lost kin in the bloody revolt. Groups of rebels, having fought for freedom, now stumbled through the streets without a clear leader. Many had tied scraps of cloth around their arms. Greens, browns, or the occasional sigil they had salvaged, to distinguish themselves from the faith's zealots. Yet the faith's hold had evaporated so suddenly that organization was lacking. Triumph was followed by confusion, and now the question loomed. Who was in charge? Marjorie Tyrell stood at the top of the grand marble steps leading from the Great September of Baylor's Plaza. The sun's pale light glinted off her dark hair, which was pinned back to keep it out of her face. Her cloak was rent in 2 places, and soot smudged her cheeks. She was surrounded by a ragtag circle of ex-prisoners, bruised, exhausted fighters. Some who had once served House Tyrell, others who had joined the uprising out of pure fury against the faith. Despite her tattered appearance, something regal still clung to her posture. She had passed the night directing the chaos inside the September, rescuing political detainees, fighting off pockets of militant resistance. Now, with morning upon them, she gazed at the city that had once been hers by marriage but never truly under her control. 3 steps below her, a freed guardsman clutched a bandaged arm. He looked up at her with an air of expectation, as did those who lingered nearby, commoners, would-be knights, and terrified septas alike. She realized they waited for orders or at least reassurance. For so long, King's Landing had known only top-down authority. Once from the Iron Throne, then from the High Sparrow's Theocracy. Marjorie inhaled unsteadily. Never had she yearned to command an army, but necessity pressed her forward. She glanced around, noticing how many stared at her. Some recognized the once queen who had openly displayed her piety under the High Sparrow's watchful eye. Others saw only a young woman whose cunning had evidently played a part in toppling a tyrant. She cleared her throat, raising her voice so those closest could hear. The High Sparrow is gone. His militant forces are scattered, and the Council of the Seven is in disarray. She paused, letting murmurs ripple through the cluster of survivors. We all know the city cannot remain leaderless. There are still pockets of violence, and winter is tightening its grip. We must restore some measure of order, or we risk letting King's Landing fall to ruin. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a ragged mustache stepped forward, pressing a fist to his heart in a gesture of respect. Lady Marjorie, if we can still call ye that. Some of us have families starvin' in Flea Bottom. The faith blocked deliveries for days. Now the stores are nearly empty, and what's left is scattered with the corpses. He faltered, tears in his voice. What are we to do? She looked at him, feeling the pang of his desperation in her own chest. We'll open what storehouses remain, and the Tyrell supply wagons that made it into the city by stealth, she replied, recalling that a few shipments from Highgarden had arrived before the final uprising. We'll organize a distribution, try to bring order to the chaos. Her voice shook slightly, the enormity of it all daunting. We must also gather the wounded for healing, regardless of their loyalties. Enough blood has been spilled. There were nods, and a few quiet, grateful exclamations. Yet not everyone seemed convinced. A handful of onlookers scowled warily, some mindful of the old rumors that Marjorie used manipulative kindness to secure power. But for the moment, these reservations remained unspoken. The ragged crowd began dispersing, some of them heading off to spread word of Marjorie's instructions. She pulled her cloak tighter and looked up at the smoking skyline. One part of her wondered if she shouldn't simply flee the capital. Another part recalled Olenna Tyrell's words in her coded letter. A new spring must bloom. Patience. Marjorie understood that she was now in a position to shape the city's future if she stayed and took the risk. Behind her, the Great September yawned open like the maw of a half-fallen giant. The interior reeked of burned parchment and sour incense. Overnight, she had managed to salvage some records from the faith's archives, which might prove valuable in negotiations. Lists of confiscated property, names of informants, transcribed confessions forced under torture. Exposing them might help unify the nobility against any remnants of theocracy. Yet brandishing them openly could also spark vendettas, or implicate once loyal allies. She would have to be careful. Stepping inside, she came upon a wide, echoing chamber. The statues of the Seven still towered in their alcoves, though soot stained their pristine faces. Cracks ran along the marble floor, and chunks of rubble lay scattered. Her footsteps sent echoes that felt unnervingly loud in the hush. Here she had spent countless hours, ostensibly in prayer, under the high Sparrow's gaze. She could practically see his pale eyes again, brimming with that serene fanaticism, as if the slightest misstep in devotion would mean her condemnation. The memory made her shiver. Across the chamber, a small group knelt in prayer, likely too frightened or too devout to leave. One of them, a septa with reddened eyes, looked up. Recognition sparked in her expression. "Queen Marjorie," she murmured, then flushed, perhaps recalling Tommen was dead and Marjorie's queenship was defunct. "My lady," she corrected, voice trembling. "Have mercy on us. We knew not the extent of the High Sparrow's cruelty. We only served the gods." Marjorie forced her tone to remain calm. "You have nothing to fear if you harmed no one. Return to your tasks of healing and comfort. The city needs septas who serve the true compassion of the seven." Then, recalling the High Sparrow's phraseology, she added, "Let your deeds be guided by mercy." The woman nodded, hope flickering in her face. "Bless you, my lady," she whispered. Marjorie watched them turn back to their quiet devotions. A part of her felt a faint disgust at anything associated with the High Sparrow, but she quelled it. True septas were not necessarily to blame for the fanatic's tyranny. Religion itself, absent man's corruption, could still be a force for solace. She left the September, her steps echoing until she emerged back into the winter sunlight. A swirl of cold air carried the acrid stench of last night's fires. Already, a few rebels were hauling corpses of faith militant soldiers into wagons for burial outside the city. The thick clang of a blacksmith's hammer rang in the distance, accompanied by sporadic cries from the traumatized small folk. She was not alone for long. Approaching from the Street of the Sisters came an older man in a once fine doublet, followed by two younger companions, all bearing the Tyrell sigil pinned crookedly to their cloaks. Their boots left crisp prints on the frosted cobblestones. Marjorie recognized the older man as Brian Foss, a distant cousin through marriage to House Tyrell. He had been one of the few still loyal to her after her imprisonment, quietly scheming for the day they might end the High Sparrow's rule. He inclined his head. "My lady, we found you at last. A portion of the City Watch, a skeleton of what it once was, has pledged to keep the peace under your guidance. We've also discovered that several lesser lords, battered by the faith's tithes, are eager to support you for the moment. They're meeting in the Red Keep's outer courtyard." Marjorie felt her breath catch. Only recently, the faith had stripped the Red Keep of all emblems of monarchy, turning it into an austere administrative center. Now it could serve as a seat of power again. But under whose authority? "I'll speak to them," she said softly. "We must ensure order, and quickly. There's a danger that looters or new tyrants will sweep in while we're distracted." Brian offered a grim nod. "Aye, my lady, led on." As they traversed King's Landing's winding streets, they witnessed more remnants of overnight carnage. Shops with broken windows, a half-charred carriage left in the middle of an intersection, a door battered in where a group of rebels had broken through to kill a known faith informant. People peered from shuttered windows, eyes wary, unsure if the fighting was truly done. In a small square near the Street of Steel, a crowd was gathered around two battered members of the faith militant, who had evidently surrendered after the chaos. They knelt with their hands tied behind their backs, shivering in the cold while an angry mob hurled curses. One man spat at them, another called out for their heads. Marjorie paused, heart pounding. She recalled the countless punishments these zealots had meted out, the humiliations, the forced confessions, the floggings, the executions. A thirst for vengeance churned among the small folk, and she could not wholly blame them. But if the city collapsed into vengeance alone, it would never climb out of the pit. She forced herself forward. "Stop!" she commanded, her voice carrying. "Stop, in the name of the realm's peace. These men must be handled with justice, not mob fury." She raised her hands, hoping to calm the onlookers. A trial, not murder in the street. First, the crowd bristled. Some shouted that the faith had butchered innocents. that the men deserved no better. But Marjorie's small retinue of Tyrell loyalists shoved their way in, brandishing steel and calling for calm. By degrees, the tension receded. The two captives looked stunned, as if expecting to die then and there. Marjorie glanced at them with mixed revulsion and pity. "Bring them to the Red Keep," she ordered. "They will face judgment." Eyes followed her as she led her band away. She could not help noticing the flicker of discontent in many expressions. The city wanted retribution. If she sought to become a unifying force, she had to balance the thirst for justice with enough mercy to avoid repeating the faith's own cruelty. It was a precarious path. They continued on, the Red Keep looming in the distance, a silhouette of jagged towers made gloomier by the drab winter light. The gates stood splintered in places, signs of a prior siege or a recent assault. The faith militant symbols had been torn down, leaving raw patches on the walls where plaster and paint had been ripped away. The portcullis was half-raised, its mechanism jammed. A cluster of men in mismatched armor kept watch, weapons at the ready. Inside the courtyard, frost covered the flagstones. Cook fires sputtered in corners, around which huddled small groups trying to keep warm. Several of the city's lesser lords or knights had gathered. Marjorie recognized a few. Lord Bywater, stooped with age, fiddling nervously with a sword belt that looked too large for him. Ser Merenceau, who had lost an eye in some prior skirmish and wore a crude leather patch, and Lady Serena Grey, who had always boasted of her devoutness until the High Sparrow's tithes devoured her estate. They turned at the sight of Marjorie, some with relief, some with guarded eyes. A young knight named Martin Follard stepped forward first, bowing. "We've been waiting, my lady. The city is raw from last night's bloodshed. We fear roving bands of brigands might exploit the chaos. We need a leader." She nodded. "I'm told you've made a start with reforming the City Watch?" Lord Bywater coughed. "Yes, but their numbers are pitiful. Many were killed by the faith or fled when the uprising started. We can muster perhaps 200 men in total." He paused to shiver, pulling his threadbare cloak around his shoulders. "And we have precious little gold to pay them." Marjorie lifted her chin. "I have access to certain funds. My grandmother, the Lady Olenna, sent shipments before the worst of it. It's not enough to sustain an army, but we can feed the watch and provide wages to keep them loyal. We must also reclaim what the faith seized. The records I found in the September, if they've survived the fires, could identify where the Sparrow's enforcers hid confiscated coin. That could help us." Ser Merence tapped the pommel of his blade. "With respect, my lady, will this not sow yet more dissent? The small folk despise the faith, but if we go rummaging through every temple or storehouse, we might appear no better than looters." Marjorie felt a wave of weariness. "We must be lawful about it. The property seized unlawfully belongs to those it was taken from, or it belongs to the realm to feed the city. We have to keep strict accounts, show the people we are not simply replacing one tyranny with another." She looked around, meeting their eyes. "If we devolve into greed and chaos, the faith's downfall will mean nothing." They murmured in cautious agreement. Lady Serena Grey cleared her throat. "We stand with you, Lady Marjorie, at least until stability is restored. But be warned, other powers in Westeros will soon learn the High Sparrow has lost the city. Who claims the throne now? Many might see a chance to seize it or to name a new king. We can't hold King's Landing against a unified army unless we build alliances swiftly. The Targaryen pretender is rumored to be in the Stormlands. The Vale stands quiet behind young Lord Robert Arryn. The Lannisters remain in the Westerlands, though severely weakened. And what of the Tyrell host at Highgarden? Will your family march to your aid?" Marjorie swallowed. The tapestry of the realm's politics had grown impossibly complex, fractured after the War of the Five Kings, battered by the faith's theocracy. "I will write to Highgarden at once. My brother Loras," she trailed off. Memories of Loras in the faith's custody, forced into abject confessions of sin, twisted her heart. She had never learned precisely what had become of him. Perhaps he was still alive, somewhere in the Red Keep's deeper dungeons or under guard in the city. The faith might have spirited him away. That uncertainty haunted her. I'll also send word to the Vale, attempt to contact the Stormlands. Though if Aegon is truly there, we must tread carefully. We don't know if he seeks the throne or would settle for an alliance. Lord Bywater and the others exchanged wary glances. None of them wanted yet another war, but they recognized that no realm can remain a vacuum for long. The city was effectively in the hands of Margaery Tyrell by default, not by coronation. If others contested her position, the result could be fresh chaos. Brian Foss lowered his voice. "My lady, might I suggest we swiftly identify the noble prisoners the faith took? There may be valuable hostages or potential allies among them." He paused. "We should also search for Ser Loras. Many in the Reach would rally if they knew he lived and was freed." A flicker of hope stirred in Margaery's chest. "Yes, let that be our first action." She turned to the assembled lords. "Choose a few men you trust. Systematically search the Red Keep's dungeon and the cells beneath the September, if it's safe enough. We free all captives, question them, and see who can help us rebuild the city." A messenger hurried into the courtyard. "My lady," he said breathlessly, "there's trouble in Flea Bottom. Without the Faith's watch, the slums have erupted in riots. Some are looting, some are settling old grudges. A half burned and collapsed, and folks are saying no one's helping them dig out survivors." Margaery repressed a shudder. She recalled how the High Sparrow had used the Faith militant as enforcers in Flea Bottom, sometimes with brutal efficiency. Now, ironically, the very presence that had once terrorized them was gone, leaving a vacuum. "Round up whatever city watch we have. Send them to keep the peace, and send a contingent with picks and shovels to help free the trapped. Show we're not blind to their suffering. We must act swiftly." The messenger nodded and dashed off. Margaery found herself wishing she had 100 more loyal men, and that her old illusions about a gentle queenship could hold. But illusions had no place now. She had to become the authority the city needed, or risk letting King's Landing drown in anarchy. She spent the rest of the day in a flurry of activity, meeting with minor officials, scribes who survived the High Sparrow's purge of court functionaries, and merchants who emerged from hiding to plead for safe trade routes. Bit by bit, they patched together a semblance of governance. Spare swords from the Red Keep's armory were distributed to loyal watchmen. Food stores were catalogued, though the results were sobering, enough for only a few weeks if rationed tightly. Draft horses were found in stables once requisitioned by the Faith. By nightfall, Margaery felt numb with exhaustion, yet she pressed on, drafting letters to be sent by Raven. Late in the evening, she stood alone in the Red Keep's highest tower that still had an intact rookery. Snow drifted through arrow slits. She wrote by candlelight, the flames sputtering in the chill. The letter to Highgarden was most urgent. An appeal for immediate aid, for more grain, for men to bolster the watch, and for news of Ser Loras. If the Tyrell lords realized King's Landing was open to a friendly approach, they might move quickly rather than cede that advantage to rivals. Margaery signed her name with a trembling hand, wondering if this letter would spark conflict. If the Lords of the Reach would see an opportunity to claim the Iron Throne themselves, or if they would rally behind her as a caretaker. She sealed it with wax, pressing the Tyrell rose insignia from a borrowed signet ring. Her eyes stung, tears threatening to fall. Just 2 years ago, she had been an ambitious young bride with illusions of queenship. Now she wrote desperate pleas, a city's fate hanging on every word. She gave the letter to a half-frozen maester who fed and calmed a raven. Then, leaning against the cold stone wall, she exhaled. Through the window, she could glimpse torchlight bobbing in the city below, where patrols skirmished with looters. The hush of distant chaos weighed on her. The High Sparrow had believed himself an instrument of the Seven, yet he had nearly destroyed King's Landing. Now it fell to her to pick up the scattered pieces. She made her way back down the winding stairs. In a small antechamber near the throne room, someone had built a crude hearth fire, and a cluster of newly freed prisoners huddled around it, wrapped in blankets. They stood and bowed awkwardly when she entered, though they looked more like frightened refugees than courtiers. A tall, hollow-cheeked man stepped forward. "You have my gratitude, Lady Margaery." I am Lord Rowan's second cousin, Hallie's Rowan. The Faith imprisoned me for refusing to tithe my orchard's entire harvest. They took everything. My family, I don't even know if they live." She placed a hand on his shoulder, an uncharacteristic gesture but one meant to convey empathy. "We will do what we can to reunite families. For now, rest here. Eat. Help us if you can. The city needs every able hand." He blinked, then nodded fervently. Another prisoner, a woman in ragged finery, spoke in a trembling voice. "They kept us in darkness for weeks. Some lost their minds. And there were rumors about a deeper dungeon where they tortured highborn captives for resisting the Faith's demands." Marjorie's blood ran cold. She had heard these rumors too. Many had not emerged from those catacombs. "We're searching every hidden cell. If we find survivors, we'll bring them here for care." Her lips thinned. "The Faith's cruelty will be exposed, and those who abetted it will answer for it." She continued on, though the knot in her stomach grew tighter. In the corridor beyond, a middle-aged knight with a limp saluted her. He wore battered plate armor that still bore the faint sigil of House Tyrell, though scratched beyond recognition. She recalled him, Ser Garth Stonewell, once a loyal retainer of Mace Tyrell, rumored to have been killed in the War of the Five Kings. Instead, he must have fallen into the High Sparrow's clutches. He bowed low. "My lady, we've found something in the lower levels. A sealed chamber behind a false wall. It appears to be a workshop of sorts, strewn with instruments of torment. There's no one alive in there now, but we discovered a small chest of documents." He glanced around, lowering his voice. "I recognized the late King Tommen's name on one of the pages. It suggests the High Sparrow had knowledge or involvement in Tommen's final hours." A cold shock ran through Marjorie. "Take me there," she said quietly, ignoring her body's exhaustion. With a curt nod, he led her through a series of musty passages, lit only by flickering torches. They passed cells whose iron gates hung crooked, some stained with dried blood. The air carried a stench of decay that made her gag. Finally, they reached a low, arched corridor where a hidden door lay wrenched open. Within, the chamber reeked of old sweat and fear. Cruel contraptions of wood and metal lined the walls, racks, spiked chairs, manacles. Thick, dark stains spattered the stone floor. Ser Garth shone his torch over a small table piled with rotting scraps of cloth and a few scrolls. "Here, my lady." He picked up a sealed parchment. The wax bore the 7-pointed star. Marjorie took it with trembling fingers and gently cracked the seal. She scanned the lines, her heart pounding. What she found was not a full confession, but a note that alluded to the boy king's soul claimed by the stranger, by design of the Faith's higher cause. It did not specifically name the High Sparrow as the orchestrator, yet it spoke of sedation, of a prepared draft to numb Tommen and slip him into an unearthly sleep. Rage twisted Marjorie's chest. She had suspected the High Sparrow's involvement but had never possessed proof. Tommen had been gentle, malleable, and for that reason, the Sparrow controlled him. But clearly the boy's continued existence had become inconvenient. Perhaps Tommen showed signs of rebelling, or perhaps the High Sparrow had seen a more direct path to power through an empty throne. She pressed the parchment to her chest, eyes brimming with unshed tears. Tommen had been naive, easily manipulated, but he was still a child who had once stammered sweet promises to her. His end had been a crime, no matter how feeble a monarch he might have been. Ser Garth grimaced. "Shall I gather the rest of the documents, my lady?" "Yes," she managed, her throat tight. "Burn the devices. No one should ever use them again. But collect every scrap of paper. We must keep them safe. The realm deserves the truth." He obeyed, and she lingered a moment, letting her hand rest on a splintered wooden contraption once used for torment. Felt profoundly wrong. With a hiss of revulsion, she turned away. The deeper she delved into the High Sparrow's secrets, the darker they became. Emerging into the corridor, she found herself leaning against the clammy stone wall to steady her breathing. Another freedman, a woman named Jane Crispin, approached, bearing a small flask of water. "My lady, are you well?" Marjorie accepted the flask gratefully. Her head throbbed with fatigue. "I'll manage. Thank you. We all have much to do." Outside, snow had ceased. The night sky was clear, with pinprick stars gleaming above the battered keep. Patrols walked the ramparts, their torches bobbing. The city beneath them still flickered with stray fires, and the wind carried faint cries. It would take 1,000 men a month or more to restore peace entirely. Marjorie felt a keen sense of urgency. If she failed to stabilize King's Landing quickly, any outside force, be it the rumored Targaryen, a resurgent Lannister, or even the Ironborn, could swoop in. The unthinkable might happen. More invasion, more war, or a second Theocracy if some other fanatic rose. She pressed her lips together, thinking of her grandmother's letter. A new spring must bloom, but winter's clutches remained. She returned to the Red Keep's Great Hall, once the seat of the Iron Throne. The throne itself, gnarled swords twisted into a monstrous chair, remained at the far end, though draped in shabby cloth by the Faith's orders. When the High Sparrow ruled, he had refused to sit there, calling it a symbol of worldly sin. Instead, he used a wooden seat in the Great September. Now the Iron Throne stood vacant, a silent reminder of everything the city had lost. Approaching it, Marjorie stared at the jutting edges of steel. So many had killed and died for that seat. She felt a bitter laugh well up in her chest. Even now, after overthrowing a false king, she had no desire to sit upon it herself. She had been a queen more than once, and each time, it ended in heartbreak and betrayal. She turned away. She would not claim a crown that brought only sorrow. Instead, she directed some watchmen to remove the cloth and clean the dais, if only so the throne room might serve again as a place for official audiences. One by one, lords and knights who had business with her or the fledgling city council trickled in. They asked questions about restitution, about claiming the properties the Faith had seized. They voiced concerns about the city's vulnerability. Each inquiry battered at Marjorie's exhausted mind. She did her best to respond with fairness, occasionally deferring to the group for consensus. While she disliked the clamor, it was healthier than the tyranny of a single voice. Let them debate. Let them propose solutions. If they truly wanted an end to the theocratic horror, they should help shape what came next. Near midnight, a hush fell as a newcomer arrived. Slipping past the half-broken doors came a figure in a patched cloak, snow dusting her blonde hair. She walked with a careful, measured gait, as if forever alert for threats. Her tall stature and plain attire belied a certain underlying strength. Marjorie recognized her, Brienne of Tarth, though rumor said she had long ago cast aside the remnants of her old name and purpose. She had once served Renly Baratheon, then Jaime Lannister, carrying out quests shaped by honor. Lately, it was said she roamed the realm on lonely errands, though no one was entirely sure whose cause she served now. She halted a respectful distance from Marjorie. "My lady," she said, her voice quiet but resonant in the near-empty hall. "I arrived in the city yesterday, after the fighting broke out. I have news from the Riverlands, should you wish to hear it." Marjorie studied her. Brienne's eyes carried a sadness and caution that bespoke many hardships. "I would hear all the news I can. The city is half blind to what happens beyond our walls." Brienne nodded, glancing at the watchers who lingered. "Then permit me to speak openly." "Please do." "I've traveled through the Riverlands, which remain fractured among petty lords. Some pledged to House Frey's remnants, others to scattered Tully loyalists. Jaime Lannister was there, trying to restore something of his family's power and gather allies to confront the High Sparrow. He now knows the Faith has fallen, but not the details. He had a small force at Riverrun, uncertain how to proceed. I suspect he may come south, though whether as friend or foe I cannot say. He despises the High Sparrow, but House Lannister and House Tyrell have complicated ties." She paused. "He will learn of Tommen's fate eventually, if he hasn't already." Marjorie's throat tightened. Jaime had always been protective of Tommen, in his own distant, tormented way. If he discovered the boy's end was orchestrated by the High Sparrow, he might view the city's new council as allies in vengeance. or he might hold them to blame for failing to save Tommen. "Did you speak with him?" "Briefly," Brienne answered. "He remains torn, it seemed. Not the man he once was, but not one wholly changed. If he feels House Lannister threatened, he'll act. He asked me to watch for the fate of his sister, Cersei. She vanished from the capital sometime after Tommen's death. Rumors swirl that she either fled or was taken by the Faith. None can say." Marjorie frowned. "If she's alive, she might attempt to rally old Lannister supporters. The city can ill afford her brand of vengeance." She chewed her lip. "Thank you for relaying this. Will you remain in King's Landing?" Brienne's gaze flickered. "I do not relish politics, but the city is in dire need of protection from opportunists. Bandits, mercenaries, or worse. I could lend my sword to your cause, provided it remains just. I swore vows to protect the innocent once, and that vow does not die easily." Marjorie felt genuine gratitude, rare amid this swirl of opportunism. "Your aid is welcome. We need honest swords now more than ever. Perhaps you could coordinate with our watch to secure the roads leading to the gate. If you discover trouble, warn us." Brienne nodded. "I will do so." She glanced around the throne room, the flickering torches casting elongated shadows. "I never thought I'd see King's Landing freed from the Sparrow's grip so soon. Yet the cost is written on every face." Marjorie inclined her head, a touch of sorrow in her voice. "We can only hope to mend it, step by step." The night wore on. Eventually, Marjorie found a moment to eat some broth in a side chamber, though her appetite had fled. Sleep tugged at her, but more messages arrived. Trouble in the harbor, tension among foreign merchants who were uncertain if the new regime would purge them as the Faith had threatened. She handled each crisis as best she could, improvising a form of governance from scattered help. By sunrise, she had snatched only a few hours of restless sleep on a cot in the Red Keep's old maid's quarters. She rose stiffly, washing her face in icy water. The reflection that greeted her in a polished metal mirror looked drawn, with circles under her eyes. But she could not falter. She had taken on a role she hadn't asked for, de facto leader of King's Landing in the aftermath of Theocracy. Abandoning it now would plunge thousands into worse misery. On the morrow, riders left through the city gates, bearing letters of appeal or summons to every corner of the realm. They traveled cautiously, for there were still outlaws lurking in the wintry countryside. Meanwhile, Marjorie supervised the partial restoration of the city's streets, urging the small folk to cooperate with patrols to quash riots. Stocks of bread and grain were carefully rationed, with loaves distributed daily at certain squares. The lines stretched for blocks, but at least people did not starve. In many ways, the effort reminded her of the High Sparrow's early methods, feeding the poor, garnering support, except now it was done to stabilize the city, not to build a fanatic army. She prayed they would see the difference. Each day brought fresh arrivals. Exiles returning to reclaim property, knights who had once deserted the city, traveling septons who swore they never condoned the High Sparrow's cruelty. Some turned themselves in, seeking absolution for their roles. Others tried to slink by unnoticed. Trials began, clumsy at first, presided over by Marjorie and a rotating council of lords and freed maesters. They avoided the extremes of the faith's methods, preferring testimony and verification. Still, there were moments of savage reprisal. Some families demanded blood for the wrongs done to them under the Theocracy. Balancing justice and mercy became a daily struggle. Marjorie's name spread through the streets as a figure of hope, or at least an improvement over the old terror. She continued searching for any trace of her brother, Loras. Days turned into a fortnight with no word. The few faith cells discovered in hidden compartments contained no sign of him. Pain gnawed at Marjorie's heart, and she half feared he had been killed long ago. Only scattered rumors suggested he might have been moved out of the city by the High Sparrow at some point, possibly to Old Town or an outlying September. If that were so, she had little means to track him right now. She pressed on, focusing on the living, on the city that demanded so much of her. Then, on a brisk afternoon, horns sounded from the ramparts. A column of men rode toward the city gates, bearing the golden rose of House Tyrell alongside the crowned stag of House Baratheon. The watchers on the walls gawked in puzzlement. Baratheon? It seemed an echo of old alliances or old claims. Marjorie, hearing the commotion, hurried to the top of the barbican. She saw 200 mounted knights approaching in orderly ranks. Their banners snapped in the cold wind, Tyrell roses interspersed with black stags on gold. At the head of the column rode a man in polished armor, wearing a half-helm that revealed a square jaw. As they neared, Marjorie recognized her uncle Garland Tyrell, known in the Reach as a steady, thoughtful commander. Beside him rode a figure in black and gold mail. When they halted at the gate, that figure lifted his visor, revealing no Baratheon face she knew. Yet he wore the sigil as though he had the right. The new arrivals requested entry in the name of House Tyrell and House Baratheon, promising no harm. Cautiously, Marjorie ordered the gates opened. Swords bristled on both sides, tension high. Garland dismounted, sweeping off his helm. He had the same brown hair and calm bearing she remembered from childhood. Though lines of care marked his face, he seemed relieved to see her. "Niece," he said, stepping forward to embrace Marjorie. She allowed it, feeling a lump in her throat. "We came as soon as we received your ravens. We had forces marshalling near Bitterbridge, ready to fight the Faith if they spilled into the Reach, but word reached us that the High Sparrow's hold on the city had collapsed." She nodded against his shoulder, inhaling the scent of horse and steel. "You're welcome here, Uncle. We need aid. The city teeters on the edge of anarchy." He drew back, his gaze flicking over the battered walls and the exhausted men on the ramparts. "We brought some provisions, though not enough to feed an entire city. More wagons follow behind. Our swift riders outran them. Also, we encountered an unexpected ally." He gestured to the man wearing the Baratheon sigil, who approached and removed his gauntlet to reveal a lean, tanned hand. "My lady," he said in a measured baritone. "I am Ser Edric Storm." Marjorie blinked in surprise. The name rang a faint bell. Edric Storm was rumored to be one of Robert Baratheon's bastards, spirited away at some point during the War of the Five Kings. She had not known he was still alive, let alone openly bearing the Baratheon banner. He inclined his head. "I've lived in hiding across the narrow sea, among other places. But with Stannis dead and Tommen gone, there are few legitimate Baratheons left. I lay no claim to the throne, bastardy forbids that, but I have men who remain loyal to the memory of House Baratheon. I heard of the High Sparrow's tyranny and decided to return, to see if Storm's End could be reclaimed. Lord Garland found me near the Stormlands, fighting off brigands. We joined forces to come here." Marjorie studied his features, dark hair reminiscent of Robert, though his manner was calmer. "House Baratheon once ruled from King's Landing. Your involvement may raise eyebrows, but if your men help restore peace, I welcome it. We need all the honest steel we can find." His lips curved in a faint smile. "I appreciate your trust, my lady. I have no interest in parading as a king. I only want to see the Faith's tyranny ended and the Baratheon name redeemed, if possible." Garland placed a hand on Edric's shoulder. "He speaks truly. We fought side by side these last weeks. He could have seized villages in the Stormlands to proclaim some false coronation, but he did not. He merely helped us fend off raiders and gather supplies." Marjorie's relief swelled. Perhaps it was an omen of better fortunes. A stable alliance. A question formed on her lips. "Uncle, what of my brother? Did you hear any mention of Loras?" Garland's eyes darkened. "None yet. We had scouts in Old Town, but they discovered no sign of him. It's possible the Faith took him elsewhere, or, gods forbid, ended his life in secret." He sighed. "But I will not abandon hope." She swallowed hard. "Nor will I," she murmured. Then she lifted her voice, gesturing to the city. "Come inside. I'll find you quarters in the Red Keep. We must speak at length about how to restore order and feed the people." The combined host rode through the battered gates, and for once, the small folk did not cower. Many recognized the Tyrell banners from days when Highgarden's produce had fed King's Landing. Though some greeted them with weariness, fearing yet another occupying force, there was at least no open hostility. Teams of watchmen guided the supply wagons to the courtyard, where newly formed quartermasters hurried to unload sacks of grain and barrels of salt fish. Marjorie accompanied Garland and Edric Storm into the keep, bringing them to a council chamber that had been hastily repaired. Over a table littered with maps, Marjorie explained the city's precarious state. The fractious lords, the scarce supplies, the possibility of external threats. Garland listened gravely, occasionally exchanging murmurs with Edric. Finally, Garland said, "We have about 700 men in total, enough to bolster your watch, to serve as a protective garrison. But not enough to withstand a large-scale siege if, say, the Targaryen pretender arrives with an army. We should prepare defensive measures, just in case." Marjorie nodded. "Agreed. But let us also reach out to this pretender A.E. Gone 6, they call him. If he truly seeks the throne, perhaps we can negotiate. I don't want fresh war on the city's doorstep." Ser Edric's dark eyes flicked to the side. "You'd treat with a Targaryen? Even after the madness of King Aerys and the destruction he wrought? House Baratheon was founded to end that line. My father struck down Rhaegar on the trident." Marjorie inhaled slowly. "I have no fondness for the Targaryens, but we must learn from the wars that have ravaged the realm. If this Aegon is wise, he'll see that conquering a ruined city brings him little. We must try for peace, or at least a stay of open hostilities." Garland tapped the map. "We'll send an envoy. Meanwhile, I'll dispatch riders to Highgarden, urging them to reinforce us quickly. If we can assemble a broad alliance, Tyrell, Baratheon loyalists, the remaining loyal lords of the Crownlands, then we might keep the peace. We must also restore some semblance of the king's justice, so the city doesn't devour itself." Marjorie thanked him, feeling a faint glimmer of hope. She was no stranger to court intrigues, but she had never juggled such dire circumstances. With Garland's calm strength and Edric's men, at least the city had a shield against immediate threats. The real question was whether the realm would let King's Landing rebuild, or whether opportunists would strike before it could stand on its own. Even as they strategized, news arrived of renewed violence in the outer districts. In the next days, Tyrell Baratheon patrols rode alongside the city watch, quelling riots and arresting cutthroats. The presence of knights in shining armor, some bearing the rose, some the stag, lent a certain confidence to the small folk. They lined up more orderly for bread distributions, though tension simmered beneath the surface. The lords who had shown grudging support for Marjorie now recognized a greater Tyrell presence in the city and adapted accordingly, offering overtures for favor or trade. Step by step, authority reasserted itself, not with the iron grip of a theocracy, but with armed men nonetheless. In private, Marjorie wrestled with guilt. She had once been adept at the Game of Thrones, charming kings and forging alliances to secure her family's power. Now, she swore her motives were nobler, to prevent another tyranny. But the line between necessity and ambition was fine indeed. She could sense how easily she might slip into the role of a queen, with an army to back her. Had she not yearned for that once, as a wide-eyed girl, dreaming of being beloved by the masses? Memories of Joffrey's cruelty, of Tommen's innocence, of the High Sparrow's manipulations flickered through her mind. Any throne, any seat of power, could become monstrous in the wrong hands. She resolved to keep the city's governance open, to avoid crowning herself. But if the realm pressed, if the chaos threatened to spiral anew, would she stand aside, or don a crown to keep the city safe? Weeks passed, the snows outside King's Landing melting in brief thaws before returning with renewed chill. Garland Tyrell's men restored partial order, though incidents continued. Still, trade wagons arrived more frequently, merchants regained confidence, and local markets tentatively reopened. Marjorie supervised an interim council made up of lords and common representatives alike, an unheard-of approach in the capital. She wanted at least to appear to give the people a voice. One night, Lady Serena Grey, whose fortunes had rebounded somewhat, hosted a modest feast in the half-repaired banquet hall of the Red Keep. Marjorie attended, wearing a simple gown of deep green. Garland was there, along with several knights and merchants. They ate hot spice stew and drank watered wine, discussing the future. The mood was cautious but more hopeful than the city had felt in years. During the feast, a messenger arrived, drawn and dusty from the road. He bowed at Marjorie's side and handed her a letter sealed with the Baelish mockingbird sigil. She frowned, recalling Peter Baelish's cunning. He had once parleyed with the High Sparrow, only to vanish when the faith's rule solidified. She excused herself from the table to read the missive in a quiet corner. The letter was brief and inscrutable, laced with Baelish's typical ambiguity. He congratulated her on the city's liberation and hinted at the value of certain alliances in the Vale. He claimed to represent the interests of young Lord Robert Arryn, who had nominal control there. He proposed an arrangement for mutual benefit, suggesting shipments of grain from the Vale in exchange for certain favors unspecified. Marjorie's lips pressed into a tight line. Baelish's meddling had played a part in countless tragedies, from Ned Stark's downfall to Sansa's miseries. Yet she could not deny that the Vale's resources might be critical to feeding King's Landing if the winter worsened. She tucked the letter away, deciding to consult Garland. They would have to be cautious, for Peter Baelish's deals were rarely what they seemed. She returned to the feast, forcing a gracious smile. But her mind stayed on edge. The game was expanding again, no longer a local matter. If the Vale came into play, and if the Targaryen pretender advanced, King's Landing would stand at a crossroads. Marjorie resolved to keep the city from tearing itself apart in a scramble for the vacant Iron Throne. A few nights later, she received word that envoys from Aegon VI would arrive by dawn. They carried a request for parley, under a flag of truce. Marjorie called for a meeting with Garland, Edric Storm, and a handful of the city's new councillors. They convened in a drafty tower room overlooking the Blackwater. Below, they could see the faint glow of torches along the shoreline, where battered ships rocked in the current. Ser Edric paced restlessly, arms crossed. If Aegon VI truly believes he's the rightful king, we have to tread lightly. He could see your position here as usurpation, my lady. Marjorie let out a weary breath. I claim no crown. This city is in my care, not my possession. I'd gladly yield it to a just ruler who can prove legitimate authority and promise not to enslave the people to another tyranny. Edric raised a brow. He might scoff at that distinction, seeing as you effectively rule from the Red Keep. Garland, standing by the window, nodded in agreement. Better that we show strong defenses and a unified front, then propose cooperation or at least neutrality. If Aegon is wise, he'll accept. If he threatens, we must be ready. One of the councillors, Lord Bywater, cleared his throat. We can't forget the small folk's sentiments. The Targaryen name still holds a mysterious allure. Some remember better days under the dragons, despite the madness of Aerys. If Aegon positions himself as a savior against the faith's remnants, the people might flock to him. Marjorie acknowledged the point. The city was weary of war. If Aegon arrived claiming he would restore prosperity, feed the poor, and punish the High Sparrow supporters, many might welcome him. She glanced at Garland. I'll meet with his envoys personally, but not alone. I want a show of solidarity. Will you stand with me? He gave a faint smile. Of course, niece. I'd not let you negotiate alone with Targaryen henchmen. At sunrise, the envoys arrived at the city gates. 2 knights bearing the 3-headed dragon's standard, along with a Dornish lady in traveling leathers. Their numbers were small, a gesture of trust or necessity. They were escorted through the still-wrecked streets to the Red Keep, where a receiving hall had been prepared. Marjorie stood flanked by Garland, Edric, and a handful of armed guards in Tyrell Green. A hush fell as the Targaryen envoys approached. The Dornish lady stepped forward first. She had sun-bronzed skin and hair braided with small golden ornaments. I am Lady Lara of House Toland, emissary for His Grace, Aegon of House Targaryen, 6th of his name. Her tone was formal. We come to treat with Lady Marjorie Tyrell of Highgarden, who currently holds King's Landing in stewardship. Marjorie inclined her head, letting the slightest courtesy shine. "We welcome you in peace, Lady Lara. Please present your terms." Lady Lara took out a sealed parchment. "His Grace acknowledges the downfall of the usurper known as the High Sparrow and wishes to ensure the safety of the capital as he continues his efforts to unite the realm. He offers terms. Open your gates to his forces, swear fealty to House Targaryen, and in return, he will spare the city any sacking or reprisals, promising fair governance. Lady Marjorie and all lords currently aligned with her will retain their titles and lands under Targaryen suzerainty. The faith militant, should they still exist here, will be outlawed. The realm shall have a king chosen by right, not by fanaticism." A hush fell. Marjorie measured her response. "These terms are generous in some respects, yet I must wonder about the realm's reaction. Not all lords will accept your Aegon's claim, especially with Daenerys Targaryen rumored to be across the sea with living dragons. Some say she is the rightful Targaryen heir." Lady Lara's jaw tightened slightly. Daenerys is his Grace's aunt, a valued member of the family, but events have kept them separate. His Grace presses his own claim, supported by allies who believe he is the true son of Prince Rhaegar. Marjorie studied the woman, searching for cracks. The tale of a secret Targaryen child saved from the sack of King's Landing had circulated. It might be truth or cunning invention. She forced a polite smile. "We do not seek conflict. The city is weary of bloodshed. However, we cannot simply hand over the gates without assurance of the safety of every inhabitant. We also have alliances to consider: House Tyrell, House Baratheon's loyalists, and others. We would want a proper gathering of the lords to confirm any new king, to avoid yet another war." Behind Lady Lara, one of the Dragon Knights stiffened. "His Grace's patience grows thin, my lady. The realm has bled under false rulers for too long. Do not test his generosity." Garland laid a hand on his sword hilt. Edric Storm bristled, stepping forward with a scowl. But Marjorie raised a hand, calming them. She addressed the knight coolly. "King's Landing is not a prize to be seized by intimidation. If Aegon VI wants to be welcomed rather than resented, he must respect our caution." Lady Lara exhaled through her nose, regaining composure. "I shall convey your words to his Grace. In the meantime, he offers a short truce. Neither side will attack the other. He proposes a formal parley at a neutral site a few leagues from the city, if you will attend. He wishes to see your good faith." Marjorie exchanged a glance with Garland. He gave a subtle nod, indicating they might gain from stalling direct confrontation. Finally, she turned back to Lady Lara. "Very well. I will attend, along with my advisors, in 1 week's time. We will discuss the city's future." The envoys bowed and withdrew, accompanied by watchmen to the gates. Once they were gone, Edric let out a dismissive snort. "Generous indeed," he muttered. "They offer leniency if we simply hand over all we've worked for. We can't trust them blindly." Garland agreed. "Still, it's better than an immediate siege. We must prepare for that possibility, though. His so-called generosity could evaporate if he senses weakness. We should bolster the walls, gather more supplies, and crucially, see if more reinforcements from Highgarden or other loyal lords can arrive." Marjorie brushed a strand of hair from her eyes. "I will go to the parley, but I won't yield the city unless we have solid assurances. The people deserve a stable realm, not another uncertain rule. If Aegon is truly Rhaegar's son, perhaps he can unite the kingdoms. But if he expects blind fealty, he'll be disappointed." She turned to Edric. "Will your Baratheon loyalists stay with us if the Targaryens press harder?" His mouth set in a firm line. "We made an oath to help restore justice, not to submit to a king whose claim remains questionable. If House Tyrell and House Baratheon's loyal remnants stand together, we might have a chance to bargain on equal footing." Marjorie nodded, relieved. So the city's precarious coalition held. For now. But she felt the tension coiling in her gut. Another wave of high-stakes politics was descending upon them, with all the old perils. As always, the small folk would suffer if lords or would-be kings decided to flex their power. She could almost feel the High Sparrow's ghostly presence mocking her. The city had thrown off one tyranny, only to face the looming shadow of a new monarchy. In the days that followed, Marjorie oversaw urgent preparations. The city watch doubled its patrols. Carpenters shored up damaged gates. Archers practiced on the walls. The Tyrell Knights helped train volunteers among the small folk, forming a militia of sorts. Though a paltry defense against a real army, it might at least deter minor raiders. More wagons arrived from the Reach, bringing flour and salted meats. Marjorie took heart in these small successes. They could hold out for a time if needed. Finally, the appointed week came. Marjorie, Garland, and a small escort of knights rode out from the city gates just before dawn. A frosty wind nipped their faces. In the distance, the pale sun rose, burnishing the horizon in copper hues. They made their way along the Rose Road, which was potholed and rutted from the faith's neglect. Behind them rode Edric Storm with 24 mounted men, the golden stag on their banners fluttering. The tension was palpable. None knew if they would return peacefully or ride into war. They reached a broad meadow some leagues south of the city, where a copse of winterbear trees lined one side. Banners in black and red, Targaryen colors, flapped beside a makeshift pavilion. Armed men in half-dragon livery stood guard. Marjorie's party halted at a respectful distance. The watchers parted to allow them entry to the pavilion. A swirl of apprehension prickled the back of Marjorie's neck. Inside, the tent was surprisingly warm. Braziers glowed, and a thick carpet covered the grass. Seated at a wooden table was a young man with silver-black hair, pale violet eyes, features reminiscent of House Targaryen. He wore fine but practical clothing, black with a subtle dragon-scale pattern. A sword leaned against his chair. At his right stood a middle-aged knight with a resolute face, John Connington, if rumors were correct. On his left stood Lady Lara, the same Dornish envoy, and a maester with a chain of tarnished links. The young man rose, nodding. Lady Marjorie Tyrell, Lord Garland Tyrell, Ser Edric Storm. I am Aegon Targaryen, your servant in the realm's cause, if you'll have me. Marjorie studied him carefully. He seemed poised, but perhaps a touch uncertain beneath his regal bearing. She inclined her head. We greet you in peace, your grace. She used the formal address, acknowledging him as a king, if only to keep the meeting civil. He gestured to seats, and the two parties settled around the table. For a time, they spoke in cautious, formal tones. Aegon reiterated that he desired no further bloodshed. He asked Marjorie about the city's well-being, praising her efforts to feed the poor. Garland listened, occasionally probing to see how Aegon responded. Edric watched from behind a measured mask, arms folded. Eventually, the talk turned to the crucial point. Aegon wished to occupy King's Landing as the rightful capital of his new reign. Marjorie explained that the city would not accept a new monarchy lightly, having just thrown off the High Sparrow's tyranny. She insisted Aegon guarantee certain freedoms. No forced confessions, no purges of those who had collaborated under duress. She also demanded that the city's newly formed council retain some voice in governance. It was an unprecedented set of demands to place upon a claiming king, but she had to try. Aegon listened, occasionally conferring with Connington and Lady Lara. His tone remained measured. He promised that the faith militant would be outlawed, that any who served under the High Sparrow but committed no atrocities would be pardoned, that he would not seize property unjustly. He agreed, in principle, to keep Marjorie's city council as an advisory body. But on the matter of who truly ruled the realm, he did not waver. He was king, and King's Landing was his seat by bloodright. The Iron Throne, he said, belonged to the Targaryens. If the people balked, they could blame the curses of recent wars, not him. He insisted his father Rhaegar would have been a noble king, and he, Aegon, intended to fulfill that promise. Marjorie realized the conversation had reached a critical juncture. If she refused, Aegon might march. If she acquiesced, she risked her tenuous authority. She glanced at Garland, who gave a subtle tilt of his head, deferring to her. She steeled herself. Your Grace, if you can guarantee the city's welfare and the open, peaceful practice of the faith without zealotry, then we may present your claim to the people. We will do so as an offer, not an imposition. Let them see your intentions are true." Aegon arched a pale brow. "I appreciate your idealism, my lady. The small folk may welcome me gladly, especially once they learn of my parentage. But a realm is not governed by popular vote. If you and your allies swear fealty, the people will follow your lead." Edric Storm spoke up at last. "You speak as though the realm has a king already, yet you have not been anointed, and many question your birth. No offense, Your Grace, but I am the son of King Robert, who fought to end Targaryen rule. Why should I bend the knee to a rumor?" A strained silence followed. John Connington stiffened, but Aegon held up a hand. "No offense taken. I understand. I am prepared to offer proof. Letters from those who smuggled me away on the night of my supposed death. Testimonies from Lord Varys and others. But I also understand that trust is not won by parchment alone. Witness my deeds. I come not with dragonfire, but with an army that leaves the countryside intact. I do not slaughter my foes if they kneel." Edric's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. Marjorie realized that, in many ways, Aegon's stance mirrored the one she and Garland had taken in the city. Restore order, limit bloodshed, quell fanaticism. He might well be a better king than many she had known. But the specter of Daenerys Targaryen and her rumored dragons hung over the conversation, unspoken. Would Aegon be overshadowed if his aunt landed with a greater force? They debated for hours, the winter sun rising higher, then beginning its descent. By day's end, they had reached an uneasy framework. The gates of King's Landing would open to Aegon and a modest contingent of his forces. He would be publicly acclaimed in a ceremony, but Marjorie would retain her position on a ruling council alongside Garland and selected lords. A greater conclave of the realm's houses would be summoned to confirm or contest Aegon's claim. Until then, the city's needs, food, shelter, rebuilding would be priority, not a campaign of conquest. It was hardly a typical path to the throne, nor entirely binding. Both parties knew the pact could fail if Aegon's larger army arrived, and he felt confident in his right to seize the city by force. But for now, they parted on civil terms, planning to stage a formal entrance within the fortnight. As Marjorie rode back to King's Landing in the gathering dusk, she felt the knot in her chest tighten anew. She had spent so long striving to free the city from the High Sparrow's cruelty, only to hand it over to a new claimant. Yet if Aegon truly meant what he said, perhaps this was the safest path. She could help shape a gentler monarchy, ensure the city did not revert to old horrors, so long as Aegon kept his word. If he broke faith, she would be at his side, ready to resist. Would that lead to more bloodshed? Possibly. But what other option did she have, alone against all the tides of Westeros? As she and her escort neared the city walls, the sky turned a deep lavender streaked with copper. She gazed at the ramparts, at the scattered silhouettes of watchmen bearing torches. The memory of the High Sparrow's reign, the silent squares, the grim parades of penance, felt distant now, yet the scars remained. The city was battered and anxious, and a fresh wave of strangers in Targaryen colors would soon march through its gates. Could this new king truly deliver them from the cycles of tyranny? She thought of the men and women who had died to overthrow the faith, the hidden dungeons where Tommen's last hours were sealed in conspiratorial parchment. The city deserved a future not defined by fear. She would fight for that, even if it meant bending to another's claim, so long as she could keep some measure of moral ground. Perhaps that was the paradox of Westeros. No perfect path existed, only the lesser evils and the hope that good intentions could one day blossom. That night, as she stood on a balcony overlooking the city, she let the cold air numb her cheeks, watching the faint glow of hearthfires in the districts below. Somewhere in those crooked streets lived families who had survived the High Sparrow's fanatics, and somewhere else, shadows of new conspiracies likely brewed. She prayed softly for the seven to guide her, though her faith had been shaken. In the hush, she almost fancied she heard the echo of the sparrow's last sermon, carried on the wind. We are all children of the gods. It is not the crown that makes a king, but the will of the divine. She closed her eyes, recalling how that will of the divine had turned to tyranny, twisted by mortal hands. And yet, she thought maybe it was possible to learn from that monstrous chapter. Men could not keep turning faith into a weapon, nor let a throne devour their better natures. She resolved that if Aegon or any other crowned head tried to become another god king, she would stand against them. Or if the people themselves yearned for a voice after so many years of oppression, she would open the city's halls to them. Hard choices lay ahead, but the city had survived worse. When she finally turned to go inside, she allowed herself a small, tired smile. The future was unwritten, fraught with dangers. But it was a future the High Sparrow no longer controlled, and that alone was a triumph. Marjorie's footsteps echoed in the corridor as she returned to her midnight duties, determined to shepherd King's Landing through whatever new storms might come. Far away in the quiet countryside, the High Sparrow was but a rumor now, a fugitive perhaps, or a wandering penitent among ruined septs. His steel crown was lost, his memory cursed. In time, bards might spin tales of his rise and fall, weaving cautionary songs about the perils of fanaticism. The theocracy he built had lasted less than 2 years, scarring the realm, but not forever defining it. Westeros was too large, too turbulent, to be tamed by one man's vision of piety. The seeds of new wars, new alliances, and possibly new hopes were already stirring. Marjorie, drifting to sleep in the Red Keep's chilly bedchamber, wondered if the realm could ever know lasting peace. She remembered tender moments with Tommen, her illusions of being a beloved queen, and how those illusions had been shattered. Still, she dared hope that her heartbreak could yield some wisdom, that if the city had learned from the High Sparrow's reign, it might reject another tyranny. In the candle's last flicker, she whispered a prayer not to any king or crown, but to the quiet part of the seven that promised mercy above judgment. Then darkness claimed the chamber, and her weary mind. Outside, a lone horn sounded from the walls, a reminder that vigilant watchmen still guarded against lurking threats. The Blackwater lapped at the stony banks. Across the silent rooftops, faint tendrils of moonlight shone on battered spires and half-repaired cathedrals. It was a city between nightmares and uncertain dreams, suspended in the hush after a tyrant's fall, awaiting the dawn of whatever new ruler would claim it. And so, under the watchful stars, King's Landing kept its secrets and its scars, carrying on as it had for centuries, no stranger to kings or fanatics, to illusions or calamities. Yet within those battered walls, people dared to believe that perhaps this time, with the High Sparrow gone, they might forge a gentler tomorrow, or at least survive to see what came next.